What is up everyone, it's Saber here and welcome to another Naruto What If. If you end up liking the video, please consider subscribing. It's free and you can take it back at any time and it really helps me out, and this is my third channel, so if you want some more what ifs, go check out my other channels. And with all of the YouTube formalities out of the way, let's get into it. The thing with immense power is that after a while it starts to become to a point aware that it is in fact immense, and like everything else wants to stay that way. Preservation is a powerful thing, so when the man known as Uchiha Madara combined the cells of Senju Hashirama within himself, he didn't know that it wasn't the cells that he was combining. Madara and Hashirama were in fact reincarnations of the transmigrant chakra of Ajura and Indra Otsutsuki, the children of Hagoromo Otsutsuki, known to the world as the Rikudo Sennin. So by combining the chakra of Ajura and Indra, Madara was able to awaken incredible power in the form of the legendary Rinnegan. What the Uchiha Patriarch did not know was that by combining such powers together, controlling what it did was not possible. After the Uchiha's death, the cycle should have continued. Ajura and Indra were to incarnate once again like they have been since they died. However, when power becomes aware, it does not wish to fade away, feeling the path that Ajura would take. Indra's chakra did the only thing that it could. It attacked. Dominance was the only thing that Indra craved at the point in time that the transmigrant chakras battled in the small blonde host. If Indra could take all of his little brother's power, then he could feel even more alive than he did with only a small portion of it. He only needed to defeat Ajura, absorb his power, and then wait for his destined body to be born. Simple enough, right? Nothing is ever simple. The brothers had no idea that their battle of wills was slowly summoning something that was never supposed to come back to this world. He had died, chose to die. He wanted to let humanity live on their own in the peaceful world that he had created. He did not wish to be treated like a god, even if he was the closest one could come to being divine and all-powerful. He had done his job, his dream, and left the world to its own devices. Did he have to leave the world of the living and have faith in humanity? No, he did not, but he chose to give them their freedom and let his body die like everyone else. At the time he had chuckled. He was practically a god his entire life, and he was choosing to leave it as a human and a mortal. Such absurdity. Not even he understood how his children's chakra was summoning his own, but he couldn't conjure up a reason to try and stop it. Even if he could, he had seen what the world was like after he had left it. Such a sad place was not his legacy, and don't even get him started on his children. So when he felt the gentle yet firm pull, he allowed it to take him again. He chuckled. Whatever force was doing this, trying to revive him, approached with trepidation. Was he really that scary? Yes, the horns were not an everyday occurrence, but they didn't make him a demon. He was quite the opposite, actually. If they only knew he was the most humble, gentle, and charismatic man ever created, they wouldn't treat him like a god, which he wasn't. Kinda now that he thought about it, the idea excited him. He could see his other 9 children again. He didn't get a whole lot of time with them the first time. He knew to a degree that his creations were treated badly since his departure. Something about sealing them into children to create solders. People of this time treated them like they were nothing more than mindless monsters, putting them on leashes like pets. He was going to change that. It took a lot to enrage the calm and peaceful man, but when he was there was nothing more terrifying than a godlike man with the power to destroy the world if he wanted to. What made it even scarier was that to him it would be easy, and nothing under the sun and moon could escape his judgment. Again, another chuckle. He created the moon, finally making his way to his destination. He had stopped the fight between his children. Literally, he arrived and everything paused. There was not a stronger will in existence than his own. It was almost omnipresent and omnipotent. The God-man just felt their presence for a second, forgetting about their unnecessary and oh so redundant fighting for the memory of their childhood when they were still his innocent children, loving and caring. Even Indra deciding that he had spent enough time just watching them. He absorbed all of Ajura's chakra and then all of Indra's. He could also feel one of his creations near as well, the strongest of them. If the enormity was anything to go by, a smile came to his face. He really missed his children, all of them. Ajura hadn't resisted at all. He actually embraced his father's overwhelming pull. He was always one to cooperate when he could, and his belief that love was the way to peace was one of the reasons he was appointed as the successor of Ninshu. He knew his youngest son would accept him. He always trusted his father and knew that even if he wanted to, he could not stand against him. Not even the gods themselves wouldn't dare deny him. Indra, however, did try and resist. He like always wanted all the power for himself. He wanted people to look at him like they did his father. 6 parts respect and 4 parts fear. It angered him that no matter how hard he tried, he could never amount to the power he knew his father possessed. It was ridiculous. How was a man able to become so fucking strong? He was so powerful that everyone knew that he had left the realm of mortals and ascended to godhood long ago. Why he let himself die like a weak mortal was beyond him. Like always, whenever his father wanted something to obey it did with little to no effort. Indra became a part of him. With one last moment of silence he allowed his entirety to synchronize with the crying baby. He was vaguely aware of the man and woman that had just taken their last breaths in this world. He guessed that they were his parents. Such a shame. He would have preferred to know them. He could also feel Kurama's presence inside himself that both made him happy and angry, which was something he disliked being. Torn, he was happy because he was so close to one of his children so quickly, and angry that one of his sons was once again in prison. Once he would change that. He now had a plan. Find his children and take them back. They would be safe with him, and he would make sure they never had to feel all the pain, loneliness and hatred they currently were, and bring back the peace he had worked so hard for. The last time he walked the earth, what his name used to be is irrelevant now. He was someone new in a new world to him, at least. Everything has changed, and he was going to change it even more. That was his destiny, and he could even feel that his new self was the same. The child of prophecy was born, and the Rikudo Sennin was back. The second coming of peace was nigh. This world, this shinobi-infested world, was corrupted and vile, the likes of which he underestimated. Everything was shrouded in secrecy and lies. No one trusted anyone, and it sickened him to his core. He was 6 now, and his life was already full of so much misery. For one, he was the Jinchuriki of the village. The very name disgusted him. A human sacrifice he was not, and his children were not. These demons, the villagers titled them, as he had seen true demons, fought them even, and they were nothing like his children. The very idea of it was complete stupidity. A weapon that was supposed to protect the very people who hated them. Absurdity. Was he truly the only one to see it as such? On the other hand, he was the bearer of the legendary dojutsu. The Rinnegan. He had known that his eyes would become legend, and that some extremes would worship him as a god even after his passing. But what actually happened was somewhat disconcerting. His name was only whispered about. Fanatical fables of a man turned god who blessed humanity with his divine assistance. Again, was such absurdity. Only just that to him. True, some of the things he had done that lasted to this era seemed impossible, godlike even, but was it truly so hard to believe that he was human? He may refuse to join the Shinobi Academy, but that didn't mean he was ignorant. The stories Kurama told him before he fell asleep were all he really needed to know, that there were people after him that did impossible feats just like he before them. He himself had witnessed some of the things his youngest son's reincarnations had done, one Senju Hashirama being one of the major ones. His Mokutan skill was tremendous, and he too was able to do the magnificent. So why was it so hard for people to believe that he created the moon? He decided the people of this era were just stupid, plain and simple. His decision was strengthened by his current situation. His 6-year-old body was sitting in the large seat of the Konoha Council chambers, his feet swinging back and forth. This had become a common thing, sitting in the uncomfortable chair, the shinobi discussing shinobi matters which in their corrupted minds involved him. The reason for these common meetings, Uzumaki Naruto, that was his name now, absolutely refused with a passion as hot as the will of fire to enroll in the Shinobi Academy. There was nothing anyone could do or say. He would have none of it. He was told about the academy when he first turned 6, the Hokage saying how strong he could become if he joined the shinobi ranks. The old Sarutobi expected a giant smile and childish remarks. What he did not expect was a nasty snort followed by a dismissive scoff. Apparently the Hokage had thought he would actually want to be a shinobi. Preposterous absurdity was what he had to think about, that the Hokage, an old man named Sarutobi Hiruzen, didn't think anything of the boy's uncharacteristically cold response to the idea of becoming a shinobi, deciding it was just childish stubbornness. That line of thinking, however, changed when he brought the idea up a second time, where Naruto just dismissed it entirely. The first time he outright refused. The second, passionately, he stated that the shinobi life was a corrupted life and he wanted nothing to do with it. Why he was so against the idea was beyond the aged warrior. After that, the council stepped in, a man named Shimura Danzo, demanding that the boy be given to him. There was talk that Danzo could make him cooperate. That made Naruto chuckle. He'd like to see the old goat try. He shook his head, his thoughts turning bitter and somewhat dark. He disliked the thought he got when thinking about shinobi and the council, but he just couldn't help it. His host tended to take a single emotion and amplify it. He was either really happy or very depressed. He had been spending hours meditating, trying to calm his emotions. It had helped a lot too. Before his last birthday he wanted nothing more than to lash out at anyone who looked at him with scornful eyes. Now though, through meditation and training he had calmed his mind, he decided that 6 was an appropriate age for him to begin his physical Training, he didn't have muscles or the strength to fight a full-grown adult yet, but he wouldn't get there without starting somewhere. He rolled his ringed eyes hearing a very old woman agree with Danzo's idea of forced cooperation. These people really craved the power they thought his eyes had. He hadn't shown them anything yet, but they had very vivid imaginations. He sighed again. They had no idea what his eyes could do. He chuckled to himself. They never would either. It was times like these that he missed his wife. She was so outspoken and knew how to handle these types of situations. He never could get a word in, everyone either purposely talking over him or ignoring him completely. If Suki were here, she'd scare the living daylights out of them and then proceed to scold them for their rude behavior. After she was finished, she'd let him say what he needed to say, and most of the time, he wouldn't have to, because during her rant she would say everything he wanted. To begin with, the very thought of his wife brought a smile to his face. Her memory lit the darkness his heart felt for the shinobi world. When the whispers stopped, his eyes raised, meeting the stares and glares of the council, both shinobi and civilian. The Hokage cleared his throat before speaking. Uzumaki, Naruto, I take it that you still refuse to enroll in the Shinobi Academy? Naruto nodded. Hiruzen frowned, taking in a deep breath. I see, that is very unfortunate. He looked like he was against what he was about to say, and he was very against what he was going to say apparently, and this was according to his supposed friend Danzo. He was jeopardizing the well-being of not just Kanagakure no Sato but of Hai no Kuni for not forcing the Jinchuriki to become a shinobi. The fact that he wasn't doing everything in his power to force the Leaf's Jinchuriki into the shinobi ranks had forced his rival to go straight to the fire daimyo. That had surprised Hiruzen, but what came of it was even more so. Apparently the daimyo's personal guard had openings that needed to be filled, and hearing that there was a child born in his country that possessed the famed eyes of the great sage had him very eager and interested in claiming him for the shinobi guardian 12. Nothing was official yet, but Konoha was to expect the fire daimyo within 6 months' time, ready to present the boy. Naruto just sighed. He knew that Hiruzen to an extent cared for him and wished nothing but the best for him. He also knew that his refusal to become a shinobi had put almost overwhelming stress on the aged man, both from his village and his country. It saddened him that the man had to go through such hardships because of him, but he couldn't relent and take up something so ugly just for the sake of one man. His beliefs were very important to him. They defined him. Ninjutsu was a perversion of ninshu, something created for nothing but the sole purpose to take another life. Creating a weapon out of a tool for peace and understanding was the ultimate betrayal. It had made him seriously doubt not only himself but mankind as a whole. He doubted mankind because even after gaining peace and understanding, they craved for nothing but war and suffering. It was an eye-opener that he seriously did not want to see. He doubted himself because after all of his hard work, his sacrifices, it wasn't enough. It didn't work. Was the way he believed in peace nothing but a naive dream? Had his belief that humanity could coexist in harmony just a foolish impossibility? That line of thought scared him, not because he wanted to turn his back on humanity, but because of the somewhat terrifying conclusions he would make had his mother been right. Otsutsuki Kagaya, the princess that ate the god tree's fruit. His mother had begun to subtly demand mankind to worship her, ruling over them like a queen or a goddess. Had she, after bringing peace to the world, seen that humanity was incapable of keeping the peace she had ushered? Had she seen the darkness within their hearts sooner than he had, she decided that to save them from themselves, that she'd have to conquer them, inevitably ruling over them. It terrified him because where he had never looked at it like that before, it made so much sense. In 6 months the Hokage began. The fire daimyo will arrive in Konoha. He has requested to meet with you. His voice was solemn. He didn't want Minato's child taken from the village. Do you understand, Naruto-kun? Naruto nodded, not particularly caring who wanted to meet with him. Hi, he replied. He knew that this meeting would be used as some way to coax him into joining the shinobi ranks, just like he knew it would be fruitless. He was a priest, a sage. He was not a killer. A shinobi. You are free to go then, Hiruzen said. He gained a sad smile when Naruto gave a giant childish sigh and practically jumped out of his seat, sprinting to the exit, happy to be excused. Naruto had never brooded in his previous life, finding it to be an unnecessary use of his facial muscles, but lately, with the council on his back, it became a common occurrence. He didn't hate shinobi, but his general dislike towards the creation and thereby the corruption of ninshu to ninjutsu made him a little bitter towards anyone who embraced said corruption. It was staggering to believe that there was anything left of the world and the human race after all the warring and conflict brought into existence with the shinobi lifestyle. How boys grew old enough to become men, lovers, husbands, fathers. It was almost Miraculous how girls lived long enough to be women lovers, wives, mothers. He was sure that it was by the intervention of something divine, because everywhere one looked there was death, pain, despair, destruction, evil. It was heartbreaking. How could his legacy, his peaceful world, become something so wrong? Having the majority of the world all but spit in your face and decline the peace you offer was as sad as it was infuriating. Were all of his so-called accomplishments his better tomorrow talk all for naught? Had he not given the world his everything? Had he not fought the demons that plagued the world? Had he not fought the tyrants who wished to rule over the weak with an iron fist? Hadn't he brought people to a better way of life? Had he not fought a god of pure destruction for the simple reason of saving them? He and his Otudo almost died on multiple occasions to save those who could not fight for themselves. And after all of it, he had decided that without understanding they would never live in harmony. So what did he do? He gave them that understanding. He shared his strength, his beliefs with them, hoping that those who couldn't save themselves would no longer have that problem. He had given them equality, and what had they done with it? They weaponized it, they disfigured it, transforming into a killing tool, into a way to easier hurt others. It was pure sickness. He had decided that during his 5th year back on this earth, the jutsu the shinobi use was a nasty blight, a plague on the people he once fought so hard for. It would sometimes bring tears to his eyes. Those tears increased when he heard the stories. Kurama had one story in particular had him absolutely sick and then absolutely furious. He lay on his bed, a long day of training his young body, making him tired, too tired to even eat anything. He smiled though, because he could never be too tired to speak with his son. He closed his eyes, the hate-filled, scornful world disappearing within seconds. His purple-ringed eyes were open like he had never shut them to begin with. He smiled, a true pure smile, as he gazed at the towering silhouette. He had gotten used to the bars that kept his son prisoner, already giving his word that as soon as he had the power he'd rip the cage apart. He had already told his child that when his eyes had matured he would never see a cage again ever. That was his word, his promise, not as a child but as the Rikudo Sennin as Uzumaki Naruto. The towering silhouette perked at the form before him, leaning down. Do get as close as possible. They spoke all the time, every day, as many times as they possibly could, but even then he couldn't get enough. Kurama smiled. It was a strange thing to most, seeing the most power bijou in existence smile in complete happiness. But then again, he wasn't most, he wasn't a stranger, an onlooker, an arrogant fool. Hello father, Kurama said in a joyful voice, happy to see his father again even though they had spoken not 2 hours ago. Hello Kurama, Naruto replied. He too had joy in his voice, obviously happy to speak with his son once again. He found that in a village full of those who hated him, speaking with his son was the one good thing he had. He would never be lonely, not as long as Kurama stayed by his side, stayed on his side. You promised to tell me the tale of my father. His smile grew. He knew that his father was one of them, a shinobi, but apparently, and this was from his own sons' mouth, Namikaze Minato was a pure, strong man who valued love and peace above all else. The Yondaime Hokage had been a man who wished for nothing but peace in a hate-filled world. His wish for peace did not only include Konoha, but that of all the nations, the world. He was a man who had killed many but dreamed of a time where no one died by another's blade. A hero, a true selfless hero who believed his son would be the one to bring the peace he so craved. If he only knew how accurate he was. While I was sealed within the woman who would become his wife, I only heard whispers of his name, occasionally leaving the tongues of those around her, her own tongue using his name. Kurama began the night's story, incredibly happy that he had this time. He had loved his father more than his siblings. In his mind, they only had a short time with him, and then, like everything in the world, he was gone, choosing to let humanity live on their own. By the time she became his mate, he already had an incredible reputation. His father had been human, but the mortality of humanity meant nothing to someone with the power that rivaled the very gods that created him. He had been hurt that his father had left him all alone in a world that saw him as nothing but hatred and a means to power. I wasn't able to hear much, but what I did hear made me almost feel as if he was the one you spoke of. That time he had later decided that his father leaving was a good idea. The way things turned out, it was something that his father would feel heartache for. The world turned his gifts into weapons, and that in his mind was the greatest disrespect the world had ever shown. He had been particularly popular for his slaughter of an IWA army. Slaughter? Naruto asked in a surprised voice, a frown marring his features. I thought he was a hero, a peaceful man. He was a little confused. Kurama chuckled, his deep voice causing the cages that held him to shake. He wished for peace, father, Kurama began, but in a world like this, peace isn't really an actual option. Yes, it was for the better that his father had left, or he would have felt pain and despair. That when he even thought about his father feeling it made Kurama angry enough to want to destroy the world entirely. There was a war, one of the world wars the shinobi have caused 3 times already. To save his people, his home, he had to go against everything he believed, everything he wished for. He had claimed to have hated humanity his entire life, but that was his biggest lie. His father was human no matter how godlike he was, and when it came to love, his father had every last drop that was in his heart. In seconds an army 1,000 strong fell by his blade. Naruto's eyes widened. He may have disliked it, but the mere idea, the mere thought that a man without his eyes could kill that many people in seconds was somewhat terrifying. He was called a hero, the person who practically ended the war single-handedly. His father deserved to be worshipped, to be put upon a gilded throne for his sacrifices. Instead he was betrayed and forgotten, to become nothing but a legend, a fairy tale. It thoroughly angered him beyond belief. I, however, was able to hear his side of things, his take of his heroic deed on the war front. Naruto had sat down, crossing his legs, getting comfortable, when his son began to spin his tail. He leaned in, his body already halfway inside the great gates that kept his son prisoner. How did he feel? Son Kurama took a second to feel the warm sensation he got in his stomach at being called son by the man he considered a father. He knew his father saw him and all the Bijou as his children, but it always felt good to be reminded that you had a place in someone's heart, that you were loved. The Yoname Hokage had gone to his wife afterwards, seeking to be consoled after losing one of his students. The pain of that loss obviously hurt him, but he managed to get through it with only shedding a single tear. He wished his father had everything he ever dreamed of, and now that he was back he would help him with anything and everything he asked of him. His chakra, he considered it his father's anyways. He could have it, all of it. His loyalty, he didn't even have to ask. Kurama was loyal to only one being, and that being was the Rikudo Sennin. His love, he only loved his father. There wasn't room for anyone else. His everything belonged to his father. It always has, and it always will. But when he got around to talking about his awe-inspiring slaughter, he had done something my container your mother had never seen or heard before. His father may have a different form, but he knew without a doubt that this boy was the host of his father, the host of the most powerful man to walk the earth. He was Otsutsuki Hagoromo. No matter what name he took now, he cried for hours, shaking like a cold infant. He had been sick after what he had done. He was forced to take the lives of 1,000 men and women in a matter of seconds, all for the sake of peace. For his home, Naruto's heart was heavy. His father becoming something of a personal hero in his mind. They were alike, he and his father. They did what they had to for the sake of the better. He was only able to better his people, his village, but the fact that he wanted peace for all villages, for all people, it made Naruto proud to be the son of Namikaze Minato. Kurama was silent for a moment, letting his father think. The next day, your mother Uzumaki Kushina asked him a certain question that even I have to admit was unexpected. This was the answer that had him thinking that maybe, just maybe, this Namikaze Minato was his father's legacy. She asked if he had the chance to take it back, to never have done it, would he take it? It still made him chuckle softly to himself. Not that anyone else but his father would know that, and he had said with a determination as hot as the sun itself that he would do it over and over again for eternity, even if he had to, because as a shinobi in the shinobi world where the darkness prevails, there absolutely had to be a light, a hope that had to do what needed to be done for the sake of not just one village, but for the sake of all villages. He had believed that with him sacrificing his soul, his beliefs, and killing those shinobi, he had ended the war, the struggle, and hopefully that would save the lives of 100,000. He had believed that with the deaths of those 1,000 and his beliefs, he had helped save all the nations from each other. At first Kurama saw it as a foolish hero act, but after thinking about it, it made so much sense. He believed that if he forfeited his personal peace, he could give peace to others. Tears ran down his small face. He was a hero. His voice was full of raw emotion, the pain, the sacrifice his father had to make, because it was the only thing he could do in this dark, twisted shinobi world, made him sick, and then it made him furious. Naruto sighed, kicking a small rock with his foot as he walked to his home. He really disliked the council because not only were they shinobi, but they had forced his father to make those hard decisions. It was the only way he could think of helping bring peace to the nations, and even though it was through the blood of thousands Naruto had commended his father, it was no easy task. The shinobi world saw to that. He kept walking, his ringed eyes watching the burnt orange sky above him. He blamed his host for this completely. Had an odd obsession with the color orange. He had almost bought this absolutely horrid orange jumpsuit, and his only reasons were that he really liked it. He had found himself doing that every so often. He would have these strange and very random instances of complete childish behavior or thoughts, like for instance his desire to prank everyone who had even ever looked at him funny. He then would have to stop, take a deep breath, and remind himself that he was not the adult he thought he was. His body was still that of a 6-year-old, and no matter how old his soul was, he was still technically 6. He sighed the struggles of being an all-powerful being reincarnated into an era that descended from his own by a little more than 1,000 years. That kind of made him chuckle. The mere thought was so absurd, unbelievable, even, but nevertheless true. He spotted the rundown aged building he called a home, causing him to sigh once again, shaking his head. His father had been the Yondaime Hokage, a man treasured by all of Hino Kuni, so why was he living in a dump idiots like to call an apartment? He was beginning to think that everyone in Konoha was blind, because there was no way the entire village was that stupid. He opened his door, not bothering to lock it. No one even wanted anything to do with him in the streets. Why would they want to break into his home? That manner of thought was crushed when sitting at his makeshift kitchen table was someone who hadn't been invited, and the older child turned to face him, his dark onyx eyes meeting his ocean blues. Uzumaki Naruto, the boy with the shoulder-length black hair, began. I know who you are. Naruto was silent for a moment, and then his face looked as if he had eaten something too sour. Time skip. What he was witnessing was in its most simplistic form impossible. He had been assigned to the boy 2 months ago, and ever since then, he knew that there was something different about Uzumaki Naruto. Yes, his Rinnegan eyes were out of the norm. The sage's eyes should only have ever belonged to the sage, but that was in fact not the reason. He believed the blonde was different. His whisker-like birthmarks, while also not of the norm, were not why he thought something was different about the child. No, these things were just physical, and he was fond of looking underneath the underneath. He found that by finding what lay behind what was obvious, one could truly see the colors of another individual. Uzumaki Naruto was different because no matter how much he watched, no matter how much he tried to learn, he could not figure the blonde out. No child, not even himself at that age, walked with that much almost palpable non-arrogant pride and confidence. Each step the boy took seemed to have purpose, like everything was important, every breath, every blink of the eye, everything. It was slightly hypnotizing, addicting, and so very absurd. Naruto was a 6-year-old boy. He shouldn't have the presence that outshined the Hokage, yet here he was almost instinctively watching over his charge, not because he was ordered to, but that it was the right thing to do, the only thing to do. That's what led him here, in a very remote part of the village that was full of tree and bush, hidden away from the eyes of others. He was an ANBU operative. He was expected to know every inch of the village, and yet there still existed a place he had never seen. The person he was sworn to protect sat on the grassy ground, his purple-ringed eyes closed in intense concentration. He watched as the village Jinchuriki, that's what the people called him, brought his left hand up. He watched through crimson eyes as with a sudden spike of chakra the boy's left hand lit up in a red flame. The red was small in amount, but with his eyes he was able to decipher what it was. The red flame was pure cleaning chakra, the likes of which should have been impossible to not only create but manipulate at all. The small flame died down like a candle in the wind, receiving an irritated sigh from its creator. Concentrating again, this time raising his right hand just like before, his hand lit into flame, this time blue. He was able to see it for what it was as well. The blue flame was yang chakra, and just like the time before, the flame died out, eliciting a small pout from the boy. He wasn't very close to the blonde, so when he began to speak to himself, who else could he have been talking to? He couldn't hear what was being said. He was only able to catch 2 words that left the boy's mouth. Normally 2 words wouldn't be very significant at all. 2 words couldn't make up an entire sentence or properly explain a situation or do much of anything really. 2 words whispered into existence shouldn't have had such weight, such magnitude as the ones that left his charge's tongue. It was like they held power that no sentence, no actual complex speech could ever carry. His heart stopped when he heard these 2 words, these 2 living expressions. He couldn't be for sure. After all, it was an absolutely absurd, ridiculous theory. Such tales were that of children's stories, the kind that parents told before bed. He may be young, the youngest since the legend that is Hatake Kakashi, but he was no innocent, ignorant child. He prided himself on knowing history, and not only that of his village, but of the world. His insight, his bigger picture, didn't just include Konohagakure. He knew his village was just as guilty of the horrendous monstrosities shinobi tend to force upon others. It was all in the name of peace and patriotic duty, but to what end? He was able to study the histories of the world, able to see both sides of the conflict, and what he saw scarred him. He had been traumatized with the horrors of the Third Shinobi World War, and contrary to his family's beliefs, it wasn't just because of the casualties of the Konoha-born. The mangled, shredded bodies of the enemies brought back as trophies and claims to fame through conquest were just as bad. The men they brought back were Someone's son, someone's family, the women were someone's daughter, someone's kin. It hurt his heart just as bad to see their lifeless corpses that had been when he decided he had come to the conclusion that even if many would disagree, peace would be impossible for the shinobi world. War, famine, death, lust, gluttony, greed, these were only a few of the things that the shinobi world caused on a daily basis, and no one short of the Rikudo Sennin himself could change all of that. He himself was a prime example of how cruel and ugly the shinobi world was. He was a pacifist, a loving child who wanted nothing but peace and understanding, yet he was cursed with prodigious talent for the shinobi arts. He was cursed with the ability to take lives with ease. An experienced veteran had at an early age he had advanced through the shinobi ranks, faster than any of his generation, rivaled only by his best friend, his brother figure. His body was almost tailored for the life of an assassin, the life of a killer, a murderer. He hated his so-called talents, his so-called genius. He had thought that nothing would change. The cycle of hatred he knew existed would continue in a never-ending loop forever as long as shinobi ruled the nations. But when he heard those two words leave the blonde Rinnegan-wielding boy's mouth, he suddenly had hope once again. He suddenly felt as if the never-ending cycle of hatred, the never-ending bloodshed shinobi brought upon the world like a plague could end. He needed to know more. He needed to study to be absolutely positive before he confronted this. Those two words were all it took for the weasel-masked ANBU operative to regain his hope for the world. He would forever remember those two words that he was able to hear. Banbutsu Sozo. After studying the Uchiha documents, what little we still have of you, I had my answer, my confirmation. Uchiha Itachi said. He was sitting with the blonde, a cup of steaming tea in his hands. You are the Rikudo Sennin. I know you are. He paused, his eyes akin to desperation. You have to be. Naruto stared at one of his eldest son's descendants, a stoic, almost cold expression on his face. He allowed the boy to speak, wanting to hear what absurd acquisition he had come up with now. However, he was a little surprised. He never thought that anyone could share his thoughts on the shinobi world. This boy, this Uchiha Itachi, was just like his father, just like Namake's Minato, a single solitary light that shined in the darkness that was the shinobi world. And if I was this man, the sage reincarnated, what would you have me do? He asked. He was curious. Itachi wore his stoic expression, his onyx eyes never leaving the purple ones. He was silent, thinking over his answer carefully. He then sighed. What I want does not matter. Naruto raised a curious eyebrow. What the world needs is someone to save it from this curse. Naruto smirked. And what is this so-called curse that the world desperately needs saving from? He asked, already knowing the answer. Shinobi. Itachi answered without pause. What the world needs to be saved from is shinobi. Naruto smiled. He stood and crossed the distance to Itachi. He put a small hand on the boy's shoulder and nodded. Okay, he began. You are right, he admitted. I am the person you believe me to be. Itachi's heart felt lighter the second that sentence left his mouth, even though he had known for weeks. And I will save this world from the shinobi who plague it. He smirked. On one condition. Itachi looked at the blonde in confusion. He would only save the planet on a condition. Was this truly the Rikudo Sennin? You help me save it. Naruto finished. Itachi's face went back to its normal stoic expression until a rare smirk crossed his face. He nodded. Hi Sennin-sama. Itachi replied. Two of the world's most peaceful men had just joined forces, ready to start their mission. Whether it be world peace or world domination still remained to be seen, for neither knew what would truly save it, but they would figure it out together. Naruto had just recently turned 7. It had been 6 months since he and Itachi met, and a lot had happened since then. One of the biggest changes was the fact that Naruto no longer looked at ninjutsu as a hideous disfigurement. Itachi had made sure of that. Apparently the godlike man, or was he a child, judged the ninja techniques too soon. He only had a basic knowledge of ninjutsu, and while refusing to join the academy was, at least in his mind, a smart idea. He had limited his learning ability. Itachi decided to correct that, teaching him everything there was to know about the art of shinobi techniques apparently, and this had even brought a small smile to his face. There was the creation of medical ninjutsu. Itachi explained it as a branch of ninjutsu that was associated with healing, something used by medical nin. That had been the day he had decided that it wasn't ninjutsu that was corrupt, it was the shinobi that used it. Ninjutsu was just an inevitable evolution, a secondary means of understanding the world, a lesser, more complicated and confusing means, but a means nonetheless. Itachi had helped him look at it in a more logical, albeit somewhat figurative way. He started to look at ninjutsu as the assassin's blade, not the assassin. It was the effect, not the cause, and he was a little embarrassed that he hadn't seen it from the beginning. With his logic, the Jinchuriki, oh, he still very much loathed that title, were the Bija they housed, not separate. Sentient beings of life. That line of thought caused him to sigh. He really needed to start his journey. He missed the rest of his children, and even though they didn't know he was back amongst them, they were still waiting for him, waiting to be saved, ready to be freed. It's not going to be that bad kid, the ANBU. He had called them the zoo, a fitting name for such a ridiculous organization that was wearing a white porcelain mask that some would say resembled a cat. He huffed. This situation was all wrong. He hadn't sighed for his current dilemma, nor had he huffed for or try at relaxing him, if it could be called that he had sighed, because he missed his caged, imprisoned, mistreated, misunderstood, beautiful children, and he huffed because there was no way in hell that this purple-haired lady's mask resembled a cat, and if anyone claimed he lacked imagination he would promptly point to the sky shouting, "I created the one thing that was direly needed for the night time, the moon, you moronic mortal." Of course he would never say that. For one, no matter how powerful he knew he was, considered himself human, even though human and mortal meant two very different things. If he were to imply that he was not mortal, the mortals would title him as something divine, something not human, and that would do nothing but upset him. Another reason was that he wasn't a hateful, brash person. He would never take his irritation out on another, no matter how good it sounded. He was a priest, a sage. He needed to have self-control, lest he wanted to accidentally lash out at someone and end an innocent life. "I know, Nico-san," Naruto replied. He wasn't at all nervous or anxious about this so-called great meeting. The fire daimyo was just another ordinary, unimpressive man before the first human born able to wield chakra. It wasn't arrogance or cockiness that made him see it as so, it was fact. He didn't look down on people because he chose to, but what else was a giant supposed to do with mice? Nico didn't reply, not that it mattered to him much, and the two walked in a comfortable silence. The ANBU operative, such an official-sounding title, came to him a little over 4 minutes ago. Apparently the fire daimyo had finally decided to grace Konohagakure no Sado with his presence, and Naruto had to drop everything he was doing, which was speaking with his only friend of this era, Uchiha Itachi, in his home, and show up for some meeting that was supposed to decide the fate of his shinobi career. He never before thought the people of the village were so stupid they actually believed they could force him to do anything. The very thought made him scoff. He hadn't been sitting around idly chit-chatting with Itachi for 6 months. He had been training, growing stronger both physically and spiritually. His eyes were maturing much faster than they had in his first life, whether that was due to his past experience or his new body's almost scary compatibility with just about everything he had discovered, and this had really shocked him, that his new body was even more compatible with his children than his past body was. His chakra and very soul could resonate with Bijou chakra. It was spectacular. He could be with his children on a level they couldn't reach before. Once they were back with him safe and sound, they would enter that plane of existence together. "We are here, Uzumaki-san," Nico announced when they came to the Hokage Tower that stood next to the Shinobi Academy. "You may enter. They have been waiting for you," she said. She bowed her head a little, a polite gesture that surprised him. Most people disliked him for what was inside him. To find one that was not blind was refreshing. "Hi." He returned the gesture, nodding his head. "Thank you, Nico-san." With one last nod, the cat-faced operative vanished in a swirl of wind and leaves. Naruto sighed, pushing the door of the tower open, taking a step into the building with slight annoyance. This was a waste of his time. He had no interest in shinobi matters, or politics for that matter, and he wasn't going to forsake his beliefs after one little insignificant meeting with one little insignificant man. These people saw themselves as much more than they actually were. They were not the kings of the land, the top dogs of the world. What they were corrupt thinkers, men, if they could be called as such, and women who preyed on the weak and shrouded the world with darkness and misery. He took a deep breath, ridding his mind of such bitter, resent-filled thoughts. He took his second step in the building, and then a third, a fourth, and so on and so forth. He walked in a leisurely pace, making his way through the building to where he knew these so-called high-ranking officials waited for him. He couldn't help but wonder if these people thought they knew even a fraction of the power he possessed. Would they still act as if they owned him? Would they still walk around as if he belonged to them, and his life could and would be decided by their hand? It was almost so amusing that he thought about showing them the true raw power his eyes possessed. He knew what the plan for today was, but he disliked it. He wasn't fond of deceit or secrecy unless it was for the actual greater good, his identity being one of those times, and he knew that this was in fact another one of those instances, but he still disliked it. Was however crucial to their plan, and he would not risk his children's happiness over his own beliefs. That was something he would not do. His children came first, no exceptions. That too made him smile. He was in fact his father's child. He turned a corner, his famed eyes roaming the hall. Before him the walls were a tannish white, the floor brown, and the lights an almost yellow. All in all, it was an average hallway decorated with pictures of famous ninja that had sacrificed their lives, and the lives of others, he might add, to save their village. He shook his head. His father had been the one case, the one exception where bloodshed had been the right and only way to peace. There were no other alternatives for him, and he hadn't been proud of the massacre he was praised for. It was an ugly, heartbreaking necessity, one not made without proper thought. Of all other options, he came to a stop at a large ornate door. He took a moment to calm his mind, readying himself. Before knocking, he waited a few moments. Before the door opened, a man with gruff features, shoulder-length black hair, and an unlit cigarette within his mouth, greeting him. "Oh, so you're Uzumaki Naruto," the man said neutrally. "Daimyo-sama, the boy is here." The man, who was wearing what looked to be either civilian clothes or really unprotected shinobi gear, said as he turned. Naruto caught sight of the white cloth that hung from his waist with the kanji for fire on it. "Asuma-san, let the boy." And a voice from inside the room called out. The newly named Asuma gave a sheepish expression, turning so that Naruto could actually enter. "Sorry about that, kid." Asuma apologized. Naruto just nodded, not really giving the thought that someone literally 1,000 years younger than him called him a kid. Entering the room, Naruto was greeted by multiple eyes of every color. The usually large meeting room looked small with all the people who crowded it attending only to see the Rinnegan child. That's what people began calling him, like he was nothing but the worth of his eyes. Shinobi tended to only crave power, not the force that harnessed said power. If someone had something that you wanted, you took it from them, as was the norm for the shinobi world. It was filthy and sickening. Naruto-kun, the Hokage, greeted the boy with a small sad smile, not looking forward to the coming storm of conversations. Naruto nodded back, a small smile of his own on his face. That was another thing that changed. During the 6 months he had gotten closer to the Hokage, which in hindsight was a very strange thing. The Hokage was a leader of the very thing he despised, shinobi. Not only did he lead them, he was in fact one of them, an old one that had committed the very dark acts that hurt his heart. But there was something different about the Sandaime as well. He wished for peace, but not out of innate pureness, but out of painful experience he had seen with his very eyes, done with his very hands, the deeds that fueled the circle of hatred. He was tired of all the hate, all the loss. Sarutobi Hiruzen wanted peace. Unfortunately, the shinobi world they lived in would have none of that talk. "So this is the child, is it?" an old unimpressive man asked in a shrill voice. I see the famed eyes," he squealed in childish delight. "Tell me, child, what do you think about your own gift from the gods?" he asked, his voice somewhat annoying and displeasing to the ears. He wore the robes of the fire daimyo, the ruler of Hai no Kuni. Even the great Kanahagakure no Sado belonged to him, so in the shinobi world he was a powerful figure. It was just as absurd as the thought of people who were treated harshly, obeying every word of the very people who despised them. He was a man with about as much prowess as a child, yet he was called powerful. He relied on the strength of others, yet he was called a king. No, he was no king. He had met actual kings. Good and bad kings fought, they conquered. Naruto chuckled. This fire daimyo was more like the court jester, a comical joke of a man. "I value my eyes, but I do not think they make me anything more than any other person." His eyes gave him the power to fall nations. In a blink he was reminded of his father and make it look like child's play. He could literally, if he so chose, destroy the entire planet, or enslave it for that matter, with a single blink, or at least he could before he departed. Of course he'd have to train more, mature his eyes more before he could amount to that once again, but it was only a matter of time. The so-called powerful man jumped up in his luxurious chair, a little like that of a child seeing a toy they wish to have, and giggled. "Ah, such a humble boy," he finally shouted. He giggled some more again before finally asking another question. "And why, oh humble child, do you see yourself that way?" he asked in utter excitement. When the creator of Ninshu had originally walked the earth, he had never been a selfish man. He was always fair, even if he had the power not to be. He believed that if you abused the power that you had, corruption would take a hold of you. Arrogance and a lust for even more power was all that waited at the end of that tunnel, and your inevitable downfall would come soon after. Even now, in this era where selfishness and abusing one's power was the status quo, he kept his beliefs strong. Seeing himself as better than another human being was a catalyst, a path that led to the practices of the shinobi ways. In this way of thought, the answer was so very simple. "I do not wish to become like you," he said, receiving a confused look from the daimyo. "A greedy, lustful man who cares for nothing but power," he answered. Honestly, another man wearing expensive-looking robe shot to his feet, a seer on his face. "How dare you!" he shouted, taking a breath to scream again. He was stopped, however, when the daimyo raised his hand, cutting the man short. "Amichi-san, please let the boy speak his mind." He then began to giggle again. "Please do elaborate, Naruto-kun." He gestured with his hand rather extravagantly to continue. Naruto sighed. He was confused with the man's odd behavior. He further explained, "Nevertheless, if history has proven anything besides that humanity cannot keep peace, is that every king has fallen, every grand nation has crumbled sooner or later." The fire daimyo nodded, signaling that he understood. "So far the reason for this is simplistic in nature, but it is always the truth, always the reason." Again the daimyo nodded, allowing him to continue. "At some point either the nation or the king or both begin to crave more. What they have begins to become not enough, and that is the genesis of their downfall." The man who he was summoned to speak with took a moment, thinking his words over before nodding. "The lust, the want for more, even though what was perfectly enough, is the spark that always sends the great kingdoms into oblivion." The fire daimyo giggled, and Naruto decided that he rather disliked the shrill noise. "Ah, so you base your humbleness on the historic theory that hunger falls kings?" He giggled again, giving him a look that made him a little uncomfortable. "Are you implying that you are a king, Naruto-kun?" he asked in a high-pitchy voice that said he thought he just spoke a hook, line, and sinker. Naruto sighed. "It is the very reason you believe I see myself as a king that I do not wish to be like you," he replied. The man gave him a questioning look, so he explained further, "Your power-hungry mind looks for more power, whether it be in the physical world, or even in speech patterns. You look for it even if it is on a subconscious level." He didn't care that he was supposed to be a 7-year-old right now. This conversation, no matter how much he would like to deny it, would decide his future. "I hadn't implied even in the slightest that I see myself as a king, but your reasoning behind your answer was that a king or nation falls for its lust for more. How can't you see why it would seem?" He was stopped when he saw the blonde-haired boy shake his head, chuckling. "That's just it. You took my example at face value. You didn't even try to understand the true meaning behind it." He sighed. "The meaning wasn't to compare myself to a king, but to explain to a man who sees himself as king that his craving for power that doesn't belong to him could be the end of him." Michi, the stout man that stood and yelled at him before, once again stood, pointing an accusing finger at him. "Is that a threat, boy?" he shouted. He then turned to the Hokage. "Hokage Dano, you should tighten the leash around your pet before he pushes his luck." Hiruzen narrowed his eyes, angry at the fact that he could do nothing for the man's hateful, distasteful words. "Leash, that was a snide remark that referred to his son, his caged, imprisoned, hurt son. That was another word that he absolutely loathed." He was so upset that he couldn't do anything but chuckle. He chuckled at the fact that he could end the man's life even with his power not at its complete strength, and how very easy it would be. He chuckled at the fact that once his children were with him, they would help him decide the fate of everyone. He also chuckled at the fact that he was not a man or child that killed, because he was offended verbally. Daimyo Naruto began, not bothering with adding any form of honorific. "This meeting was to discuss something you wanted to propose, right?" he asked, suggesting that he wanted the conversation to be over as quickly as possible. After getting over the shock of the boy's words, which actually made sense, he went back to his annoying self. "Ah yes," he giggled. "Naruto-kun, I understand that you do not wish to join the Shinobi Academy in Konoha." Naruto gave a short nod, allowing the man to continue. "Ah yes, well," he began, "I would like to formally invite you to join." Naruto held up a hand, stopping the man. "Whatever you are offering, I respectably decline," he said. Hiruzen sighed. He knew this was going to happen. "I've actually decided to become a shinobi," he stated, causing the Hokage's eyes to widen. Naruto turned to the aged Sarutobi. "Hokage-sama," he added the honorific, knowing that it wouldn't really bother the daimyo. "But Michi, I will join the shinobi ranks on one condition." He held up a single finger. Hiruzen blinked a few times before clearing his throat. "And what is the condition, Naruto-kun?" he asked. The fire daimyo was speechless, hanging his head down to pout childishly for not getting what he wanted. No matter how much power he figuratively possessed, he could not force a person born in Konoha to join his bodyguards. It was the one rule he had to follow. He wasn't a fool, which would have shocked anyone that had ever met him. He knew how the deal with his shinobi village worked. They let him make it look like he was the top dog. If he provided them with proper funds in return, they'd protect him and his capital. A win-win for everyone. So now that the boy was crying shinobi, he no longer was able to claim him. Naruto smirked before answering the question with a name. "Uchiha Itachi." Naruto began. "I will become a shinobi as long as Uchiha Itachi is my sensei." Yes, he very much disliked deceit. Hiruzen was silent for a moment, his analytical mind going through multiple scenarios at the speed that would make a Nara blush. After a good minute of thinking, he asked his question, "And why do you specifically request Uchiha Itachi?" He knew that Itachi was one of his most loyal, not to mention talented operatives, but the whole Uchiha crisis caused his old tired mind to be wary. Naruto took in a deep breath, closing his eyes. This change, that occurred within the last 6 months, had surprised him the most. While sparring with Itachi, he asked to see the young ANB use dojutsu, knowing it to be a power Indra was born with. He knew it to be a power of darkness to gain the awesome abilities the Sharingan was capable of. One had to suffer much loss. Itachi, like always, did as he was asked and activated the curse of his clan. The moment the purple-ringed Rinnegan eyes met the crimson three-tomo Sharingan, something within the blonde awoke. A sharp, breathtaking pain had overtaken Naruto, and his eyes burned like the sun. The pain lasted only for a second, and when he had finally been able to open his eyes, Itachi had dropped to his knees, his arms going limp and tears falling from his now black orbs. When Naruto had opened his eyes, Itachi had seen me in a single word: impossible. The world had only seen these eyes twice before, and each time the world feared their wielder. With these eyes the mountains would move. When told to move with these eyes, the waters would part. When told to part with these eyes, the gods themselves shook in fear. All these things were true when these eyes gazed upon the mortal world. Naruto opened his eyes. The occupants of the room stood there, shock written all over their faces, their minds a jumbled mess. Silence. The Rinnegan, the Samsara eyes, were said to be the greatest of all dojutsu, the most powerful eyes to ever exist. This, however, was not the case. What trickery is this? Michi, a man Naruto began to believe was good for nothing but annoying him, shouted, staring back at the self-proclaimed kings of the country. A Rinnegan with 9 tomo sitting on its rings, 3 per ripple, held amusement. Uchiha Itachi is my friend, and I need to be taught how to use the Sharingan. His voice held his amusement, but just barely. The Rinne Sharingan had returned, and they obeyed Uzumaki. Naruto, now the eyes of God, stared back at mere men, mere mortals. The true king was amongst the peasants. Not that he saw it as that he was just a man, a boy, a virtually indestructible, immortal, omnipotent man, but a man nonetheless. The devil's hands have been busy. The daimyo whispered, his entire body feeling numb at seeing what was it he was seeing. That is my condition, Hokage-sama. Naruto continued. Uchiha Itachi, no one else having to learn how to use the Sharingan was a little white lie that was necessary, but it still was something that he very much disliked. He was a man of his word. Lying and secrecy was an annoying fact of life in this era, a fact that even he could not avoid. He was doing it for the betterment of the world, of his children and family, but it still made him uncomfortable that he was apparently good enough to lie straight to the faces of trained shinobi. Was as disconcerting as it was comical. In his past life, his third eye held the Rinne Sharingan, and he was very capable of using its abilities, having created his son's greatest technique, but chose not to rely on them. They were not a power to be used without caution. He was a firm believer that abuse of power led to arrogance and the downfall of more humans than he was willing to admit. Hiruzen gulped, shaking his head to clear his mind. The eyes he was looking at, they were not of this world. Hi Naruto-kun, the Sandaime began. I agree to your terms. He signaled someone unknown with his left hand, his fingers forming strange signs. In less than 2 seconds, in a blink of an eye, someone from the zoo was at the aged man's side as he began to speak with the operative silently. The blonde let the tomo that sat on the rings of his Rinnegan fade, not needing those eyes, they were meant for domination, absolute, inescapable world domination. A chill ran down his back and his heart suddenly felt heavy. He might have to use those eyes for this incorrigible shinobi world, and that was almost too much weight for his already heavy shoulders. The way things were looking, absolute subjugation through massive amounts of subterfuge and, for lack of a better word, bullying, was the only way to save the world from its worst enemy, humanity. Naruto panted. His small child body was not used to such physical workouts. Itachi was currently pushing his body to the absolute limits. If he wasn't a Jinchuriki and an Uzumaki to boot, which apparently made him an endurance monster, he probably would have collapsed by now from fatigue. Taijutsu was what this era dubbed martial arts, or the optimization of natural human abilities by accessing one's physical and mental energies, which relied heavily on stamina and strength gained through vigorous training. One could execute body techniques. Naruto had never really trained his previous body in martial arts, not having to rely on his own body too much when it came to his battles. His eyes were always more than enough to get the job done. Itachi, however, convinced him that, in a world where people could move faster than sound and demolish mountains with a single punch he was sure that Senju Tsunade was Suki's descendant, that having knowledge and experience with taijutsu would come in handy. He was no longer in a world where the very whisper of his name sent the Shinigami himself running in fear. He was someone else in a very different world. He would have to show the world who he was, gain that incredible status. Once again that thought caused him to chuckle softly. He had sent kings fleeing, tyrants and pirates alike scurrying, and the gods themselves kept their distance. He was not an overly proud man or arrogant in any meaning of the word, but even he had to admit that he was a man both respected and feared by the entire world. It was somewhat annoying that he was seen as nothing but a child now. Well, he'd just have to remind the kings, the tyrants, the pirates and gods who he was and why he was not a man to be trifled with. He would save the world. He would save his children. He would do all these things. He swore he was Uzumaki Naruto, the Rikudo Sennin, and he never broke his promises. So here he was practicing the god-awful kata Itachi said was perfect for him. Apparently Itachi had a sense of humor, because naming the tailor-made taijutsu the Sennin no Mai was just too much for it not to be a crack at him. Sennin-sama, Itachi suddenly said, stopping the light spar. Let's take a break. Naruto sighed, thankful for the much-needed break. He was a stamina tank, but he was still 7. He took a seat on the ground, his eyes gazing at the moon, which was slowly rising as the sun was setting. It was a beautiful sight, and Naruto decided to share it. Itachi, he began, sit with me little dragon. That was something he started calling Itachi little dragon. He was an Uchiha, fire breather. They were a clan of powerful mighty dragons, their hearts ablaze with the will of fire. He's heard so much about Itachi, had spoken about the curse of hatred, something that seemed to plague the clan. Naruto had immediately dismissed that theory. There was no such thing as a curse of hatred. It wasn't possible, since even as individuals the Uchiha were the most loving people the world had ever seen. They were his descendants, and he refused to believe that his children the Senju and Uchiha were born with hatred. Hatred was akin to a parasite. It needed a living host and would continue to derive nutrients at the host's expense. No, the Uchiha were not born hateful. They just had the unfortunate capability of loving with all of their hearts, not just a part of it. Once that love was lost or taken from them, love would become hate, and hate would come if the fall of the hateful. Itachi didn't move for a moment until he gave a small smile and did as he was told. He knew what was coming. This was what the young Uchiha waited for, craved for. He loved history of any kind, and what better history was there than the history of the Rikudo Sennin? After long training sessions, Naruto would thank him with a tale that would blow the Uchiha's mind. The life of the Sage of Six Paths was by far the most amazing fable. Every memory held such importance as every step molded the world, changed it, and with every word the blonde held his attention, every wave of his hand surprising him, being so captured by the stories being told. The words that left the tongue of the younger boy held more value than gold, than village secrets, than everything. They were in a smaller training ground, an Uchiha owned one that only Itachi ever used. They had been there for hours already, and it had been like that since the meeting with the fire daimyo a week ago. He was becoming a shinobi, and Itachi was his personal sensei. It was uncommon for shinobi to be given this type of attention before they even became a genin, but not unheard of. Most of the times this happened though was through a family member who was already in the shinobi ranks, but when you possess a Rinnegan and a new form of Sharingan to boot, you got certain advantages. Yes, he was training in certain shinobi fields, but he was not going to actually become a shinobi. He would not sink into the corruption that followed said lifestyle. Itachi moved with purpose, lying down next to the person he called friend, eager to listen and listen. He did. Tsukuyami, Naruto began, was the most beautiful goddess I have ever laid eyes on. That one sentence caused the stoic calm Uchiha to shoot upright, eyes wide. Why, you met the moon goddess? He asked in shock. Naruto chuckled, his eyes closed, a look of pleasant reminiscence on his face. I didn't just meet her, my little dragon. Naruto began smirking. This would be amusing, he decided. I married her and she mothered my children. Itachi froze. Two figures walked side by side, their long white kimonos flirting with the earth. They walked on to the right. A tall man with shoulder-length pale red hair stood, a black dual-headed shakujo in his right hand, one end with the typical ringed hoop, the other a crescent-shaped curve. His back was decorated with a large red Rinnegan-like marking with a pattern of 9 red Magatama arranged in 3 rows of 3 beneath it. He walked with near hypnotizing purpose, and the very air around him seemed cleaner, purer. To the left, a similarly tall man with long white hair stood, a sheathed sword on his hip and a shakujo in his left hand. His every step was that of a noble. The very ground under his feet almost thankful to be stepped on. The 2 young men walked towards the fiery sun. Their minds made they were needed in the northeast, so that's where they were headed. The 2 walked in the most comfortable silence, the very surrounding nature seeming to silence in their presence, not out of fear but out of respect. They wore stoic expressions, walking calmly to their destination. They had been walking before the sun began to rise, and they would most likely be walking long after it sets. There was work to be done, and it was of great importance. Suddenly they both stopped feeling it before it actually appeared. A bright, incredibly powerful light shot down from the sky. It hit the earth and didn't disappear for a good 5 seconds. The earth was torn apart from the blast and shook from its force. The impact was hard enough to disturb the almost religious silence nature was showing the two figures. As the light faded and the silence began to return, the long-haired man spoke, his very voice carrying more elegance and nobility than 10 kings. San, it looks like they've sent another. Neither moved, nor even bothered to pay attention to the form that had come from the extremely powerful light, seemingly from the heavens it would seem. So the second man sighed. He was a man of peace, and his brother was no different. Why couldn't they see that he actually looked sad, like it hurt him? The man with long white hair was the first to meet the eyes of the newcomer. Her lavender eyes met his featureless white orbs. He glanced at his brother, noticing the saddened look on his face, and narrowed his eyes, turning back to the intruder. His brother was a great man, someone who healed and asked for nothing, someone who gave and never took. He was a bringer of peace, and the fact that these arrogant, asinine, egotistical pests couldn't see that somewhat angered him. A form came from the light, a woman with light blonde hair and lavender eyes, garbed in a white kimono similar to theirs. She was nowhere as tall as either of them, but the aura she radiated was no less palpable, an aura of superiority, the likes of which almost seemed to surpass the furious look on her otherwise breathtakingly beautiful features. Had the short-haired man most curious? She looked at him, the short-haired man, and snarled. Her lavender eyes met his purple-ringed eyes that gave him powers he wasn't supposed to possess. He was mortal and no function but to destroy human, and her people were not happy that such prowess was given to one so unworthy. Their horns could not fool her or her people. They were human, no matter how divine they may look. She opened her mouth to speak, and speak she did. Otsutsuki Hagoromo, the Rinnegan, is not a power mere mortals should be in possession of, she said bluntly and to the point. Forfeit what does not belong to you, or I shall make you give up what is not yours. What had transpired next happened in the blink of an eye, faster for even someone like her to not react fast enough. The white-haired man, planting his black shakujo in the ground, vanished. A loud booming noise coming from the action. He had broken the sound barrier with frightening ease. Suddenly and without warning, the horned, pale-eyed man was face to face with the woman who dared to speak to his brother like a peasant, his blade poised and already swinging at her in a mighty arc. Then the most powerful man spoke, his whisper of a voice carrying more strength than 10 nations. Hamura. The simple call of his brother's name was enough to stop the powerful man mid-swing. Otsutsuki Hamura, still wearing his ever stoic expression, turned his blade and instead swiped at the air to the left of the woman, and again he vanished. The moment he appeared next to his brother, Hamura was already sheathing his blade before he could completely sheath it. Though the woman smirked, the mighty Hamura still does as he's told by his brother, who's not 5 minutes older than he. Hamura did not respond to this, instead just sheathing his sword with an audible click, and with the click the mass of trees that was to the woman's left, where the man she had just mocked swung his famed sword, split like paper. Miles of forest was cut clean with a single swing. To her credit, the woman didn't show her nervousness, nothing but a bead of sweat falling from her brow, but that was enough for Hamura, his eyes able to see everything from her fast heartbeat to her lungs inhaling and exhaling oxygen at a quickened pace. Good, she now knew her place. What is your name, goddess? San. Otsutsuki Hagoromo, a man of power and peace, asked. His politeness and willingness to speak was appreciated by the woman. She had obviously underestimated Hamura, and that was her very first mistake. His brother, even without the Rinnegan, was a man that could even face him on equal ground, and his skill with a sword was rivaled by none. I am Tsukuyami, she replied. Hagoromo was actually surprised. He never thought he'd meet the goddess his mother named her ultimate techniques. After the reality bender, he replied smiling. It is a pleasure to meet you, Tsukuyami-san, he said as he lowered his head. Little out of respect for the beautiful woman. Even without a domain, you are highly respected both in humanity's eyes and the divine hierarchy. His powerful, feared eyes met her lavender ones, a small smile on her face. No matter what her dislikes were with him, a compliment from the legendary priest was something very appreciated by anyone who was given one. Flattery will get you nowhere, Hagoromo-san. She decided to add the honorific, since he was being so polite, not wanting to be shown up by a human. You will hand over those eyes. Hagoromo closed his eyes, a small smile on his face. Polite manners, not flattery, Tsukuyami-san, he replied, and I'm most curious as to why you and your people believe my eyes do not belong to me, he said. His voice was still calm and neither man showed too much emotion. Their faces ever stoic. Those eyes are divine, and they do not belong to mortals. Life and death are powers that cause catastrophe. When in your kind's hands, she said truthfully, your mother is proof enough of that. Thus her second mistake. My mother does not represent all of humanity, just as you do not represent all deities. It is a narrow-minded and, to be honest, moronic way of thought. Hamura answered. His family meant everything to him more than anything else, and he would not have others judge or claim to know what they clearly did not. And I will only say this once, he continued, the veins around his eye sockets bulging. Never speak of my mother again, or I'll cut your tongue out. Vermin. Hamura was a little overprotective. Calm, brother, Hagoromo whispered, seemingly relaxing the angered man with his voice alone. But he is right, Tsukuyami-san. His eyes met hers. Leave our mother's name out of your mouth. He paused, letting the words sit before he gave her a small smile. Please, the two of you speak as if you can command me, the supposed goddess proclaimed with narrowed eyes. You are but hairless age, she snarled. Know your place. With that said, the reality bender shot off an almost purple-pink after image. Following her, she raised her arm, and beams the same color as her after image shot from her body, rushing at the man who stole God's eyes. When the beams of pure chakra and life energy came within inches of the holy man's flesh, they suddenly stopped, only to begin shrinking, being absorbed into Hagoromo's body by the Preta path. Even the gods couldn't scar him. Tsukuyami sighed. I was hoping to do this the easy way. She shook her head. But like all humans, you can't see the bigger picture of things. She sighed again, this time dramatically. And here I thought the great priest of the six paths was a reasonable and intelligent man. Hagoromo just smiled softly at the woman. Intelligent, fairly reasonable on occasion. He chuckled softly to himself. As for this bigger picture, it's not about who can and can't see it. Hamura allowed himself a small smile, already hearing this from his wise brother. It's about who can comprehend it. He smiled again. The straw that broke the camel's back, if you will. The air became heavy, the peaceful aura vanishing. Tsukuyami's lavender eyes darkened to a deep purple, her very skin seemingly falling upwards towards the heavens, only leaving purple skin bright enough to blind some. A halo hovered over her head, almost pink hair standing resembling wings, and then the angelic form before them smiled. It was something that befitted a demon, not a divine entity. Such a foolish human, to act as if he is smarter than a goddess. She started. I will have those eyes, she snarled. The eyes you used to kill my brother. The goddess in her true god form blasted off at the brothers who would later slay God. Rage-filled eyes narrowed in total righteous fury. Hamura looked to his brother, a sorrowful expression on his face. The deity had just brought up one of the few things that his brother actually regretted. It broke his heart to have to do what he did, but he did. He had to do it. It was not done lightly, but out of necessity. He had to kill the great stone of summer. He had to kill Susanoo. Instead of an angry look of denial, Tsukuyami came face to face with a mournful one, tears falling silently to the ground. She didn't stop the second her energy-covered fist was about to make contact with his face. Hagoromo's eyes snapped onto her, the rings of his eyes almost bulging. Hamura took a step back. The gods were about to duel. It was an impossible absurdity. He was not human. He couldn't be. She was sure. She panted, her sore body exhausted beyond anything she had ever felt before. She could hardly breathe. Her bones ached and her muscles screamed. She had near infinite chakra, much more than her siblings, yet she could hardly feel what was left. Was there anything left? She was alive for now, so she must have some chakra. She tried to raise her head. She just laid there, not even able to raise her own head. This was pathetic, mortifying on a level she never knew existed. A human? No, that's wrong. He was not human. He was something else, transcended. He beat her down. He crushed her with such power she had actually been frightened by. He scared her. If she could, she would chuckle. She was proud of herself. Even without looking, she knew what was there, the surrounding as far as the eye could see, and considering who was around at the time, that was extremely far. Was scarred, flattened, raised. They probably split the country in two. Maybe not that bad, but she had never seen so much destruction, so much carnage. She had lasted 3 days. She was able to stand against the great priest for 3 days. Even if she didn't even scratch his skin, she had lasted for 3 days, and that in itself to her was the only kind of victory anyone who fought the holy man could attain. His shadow announced him as passive and untired face. Soon, staring at her from above, she looked at him with something akin to acceptance. She did Not fear him anymore. Why would she? There was nothing she could do. Fear was an annoyingly human emotion, so she discarded it after realizing that Otsutsuki Hagoromo was even more powerful than she. Are you going to kill me now too, like you murdered my brother? She asked in a tired voice, more of a whisper than anything. The pain that entered the godman's eyes confused her. Tsukuyami, the dropping of sand from her name was noticed. I did not wish to kill Susanoo. Then why did you? She screamed, not caring enough to hold the tears in anymore. You took him away from us. Hagoromo wouldn't allow his eyes to leave hers. It seemed it was time to tell her. Susanoo lost his mind when his wife was killed, he suddenly said. Tsukuyami's eyes narrowed. He became insane, going into a killing frenzy for 5 days. He sighed at the goddess's disbelieving look. He killed thousands of people. Tsukuyami, thousands of innocent men, women, and children lost their lives. To his broken self, liar, the goddess shouted, refusing to meet his truthful gaze. It's the truth, Himuro, began Nisan, and I tried to convince him to stop, even offered him our help. The younger of the twins huffed. The fool waited for my back to be turned to strike me like a coward, he continued, not really caring about the woman's feelings. He was killed trying to take my life. He was rabid, a mindless husk of his former self. Hagoromo finally allowed himself to close his eyes, the gravity of his actions weighing on his shoulders. Susanoo loved his wife more than life itself, and when a nasty demon took her away from him, he had lost himself. He took to bloodlust, craving nothing but death. He became what he and his brother fought, what they protected mortals from. Susanoo had become a demon. Seeing the genuine expression of regret and truthfulness caused her to clench her fists. She was such a fool. She had judged too soon, jumping to conclusions before she truly knew the situation. Brother Himuro began. We need to go. Hagoromo turned to his twin, his fellow protector of the powerless. We have wasted enough time as it is. The pale-eyed Otsutsuki didn't mean to sound insensitive or arrogant, he just naturally sounded so. He carried more grace, more nobility than even Hagoromo, and if he was anything, he was blunt to a fault. Even Hagoromo sighed. His brother was right. We must be taking our leave. Tsukuyami-san, he nodded his head. We are needed elsewhere. With that said, the brothers turned, walking away without another word. The goddess had long since taken her human form again. She just sat in the destruction caused by her foolishness, tears running down her tired face. Her brother was turned into a monster, tainted by his own hatred and sorrow, and he was cleansed from the human realm by the holy sage. Tsukuyami cried. Very little could cause the two most powerful men in world such absolute anger, such absolute rage, that they were currently feeling. They were peaceful, caring men. Their life mission to guard the sacred beauty that is life. Rage and hatred were two things that were somewhat foreign to them, but right now, at this very moment, they were so very livid. The wildlife ran in the opposite direction, the plants whimpering in their presence. The ground trembled, and the air was heavy and thick. There was no reverence shown to them by all things natural, only fear. They cried tears of anger. Everyone was dead. They had heard rumors of a demon rampaging across the country, leaving a trail of bodies and despair in its wake, but they didn't think that anything like this would happen. The demonic entity had only taken a handful of lives since the start of its carnage, but this was a massacre. The entirety of the small village was butchered, even the children. A small arm, that of a child, reached for the sky, buried in a pile of other bodies, broken and bloody corpses just laid out for anyone to see. It was a message the foul creature knew they were tracking it. A sharp intake of breath sounded out behind them. Neither man was surprised. They had felt her trailing behind them, her obvious curiosity in them pushing her to follow, to witness with her own eyes what the men who stole from Kami did with their theft. She now wished she hadn't followed. What happened? Tsukuyami asked. She was no stranger to death, having witnessed and caused bloodshed on and off the battlefield, but never before had she seen such malice, such horrid massacre in all her life. No matter what the reason, there was never a proper cause to murder children. They were innocent. The sins of their ancestors were just that, their ancestors. This was an ugly thing, something that made her sick. This is the work of the real enemy. Tsukuyami-san, Hagoromo spoke, the anger in his voice cutting the very silence like a hot knife through warm butter. A brutal, disgusting act meant to anger us. Hagoromo began to walk through the blood-stained village, a look in his eyes that Tsukuyami could not make out. There's only one thing wrong with his little plan. Himuro began, his pale eyes filled with wrath and fury. Tsukuyami turned her head to the tall man, her face questioning. Himuro looked to his brother, the two of them sharing a look. It worked. The sound of Hagoromo clapping his hands together, his fingers then interlacing, was heard, and then suddenly, and without warning, the entire village lit up in a dark purple light. Tsukuyami's eyes widened, her heart nearly stopping. The sheer size and density of the chakra the man before her was unleashing on the village was to be blunt, omnipotent. He Hadn't even used a sliver of a fraction of this kind of power against her. If he had, she would have surely died immediately. She was once again afraid of the holy soldier. The purple flames licked at the blood-soaked soil, a presence she was vaguely familiar with. Her breathing was labored, her throat suddenly dry. With her own eyes she was witness to the most frightening feat she had ever seen in her lifetime. Yama, the king of hell, rose, his eyes matching that of the man she was now terrified of. The priest was commanding the bloody king of hell with another huge surge of chakra, and the great mouth of Yama stretched open to impossible proportions, obeying the commands of the sage. Again, with another incredibly ridiculous amount of chakra, the king began to spit green lights. Within seconds, Tsukuyomi knew what the lights were. They were souls, the souls of the dead. The holy man was resurrecting the dead. It was terrifying, it was absurd, it was impossible, it was beautiful. Hagoromo wasn't just reviving the dead. He was like a beacon of rejuvenation. The scarred and broken bodies of the unfortunate murdered, healing at rates not possible. Hagoromo was washing the death from the land, breathing life back into the village. In both the villagers and nature, he was fixing the world, it seemed. Tsukuyomi managed to tear her hypnotizing stare from the man and fixed it in his brother. She was met with something rather strange. Himura was smiling. The last soul left the king of hell's mouth, the last of the deceased, raised with a silent command. Yama slowly faded back into the ground. The purple flames, an overwhelmingly dark presence, retreating, moving with purpose. The brothers began to make their way out of the village, a confused goddess hot on their heels. Why hadn't they waited for the mortals to gain consciousness? Why hadn't they accepted the inevitable thanks and reverence they would have definitely received? It was a little suspicious. Her curiosity eventually won out, and she asked the question that practically burned the tip of her tongue, demanding to be voiced. Why did you leave before the mortals woke? She raised an eyebrow. Have you something to hide? Hagoromo stopped Himura doing the same. The priest looked tired. The next words he spoke would change the way the goddess looked at him forever. I wish to keep my humanity.